Hello, world. Welcome to the Thursday process. I'm super glad to be joining you here today on Thursday. We're going to get started in just 2 minutes' time. So if you need to grab a glass of water, refill the coffee, whatever, popcorn, it's going to be a blast. It always is. So now's the time to grab any materials you might need. We'll be starting in 2 minutes' time. For those of you trickling in, appreciate you joining us today. We're getting started in just a couple of minutes, so if you need to grab pen and paper, cup of coffee, snack, whatever you might want, now's the time to do that at 11:32 Eastern or 2 past the half hour, your local time. That's when we'll get started. So you're in the right place. Getting started in about 60 seconds. Can't believe it's Groundhog Day already.
Right.
Yeah, I can't believe it's Groundhog Day already.
Yeah. It seems crazy to be February.
Yeah, January zipped by fast.
Yeah.
So those of
Yeah.
you who are in a sales role on this call, your pipeline should be built for the rest of the year already. Get after it.
That's right. You're behind.
Those of you trickling in, appreciate you joining us today. Welcome to the Thursday process. We'll get started in about 15 seconds here or so, right at 2 past the hour. So appreciate you popping in. We'll go ahead and get started. Quick disclaimer here at the top of the presentation. The presentations on Thursday process are intended for educational purposes only. They should not replace independent professional advice or your own personal judgment. Statements of facts and opinions are expressed are those of the participants individually. They don't represent the opinion or position of their employers or certifying bodies. Nothing presented should be considered legal or financial advice. An extra little uh, tidbit on this one. We're talking about disaster recovery today, so you absolutely should be following your own best practices and your professional judgment on this. None of this is assuming or accepting any sort of liability around a disaster scenario. You may be watching this on demand. If so, please consider that the information has not changed or updated since the original presentation. Today is the 2nd of February. It's 11:33 a.m. Eastern Time, and we don't update these presentations after recording them. So just be aware if you're watching this on demand on YouTube or on the R&R website, it's a static presentation and not updated. A little bit of housekeeping. There are polls that will come up throughout this presentation. They'll pop up on your screen. You just choose an answer, click submit. Those polls are crazy important. The content calendar we have for Q1 of 23 has already been set. All the guests are locked in. Damien and I started talking back in December about this talk. So you giving answers is what steers the content for this. So I appreciate your participation in the polls. During Q&A, there's a Q&A section. Go ahead and throw your questions out. We've got a couple of minutes at the end of the talk for questions, but throw them out when you have them so you don't forget them. And as we're able, we'll stitch them into the talk when appropriate to handle them live, or we'll handle them at the end of the presentation. If your question isn't answered by the end of the presentation, I will get you an answer. So put it out there. If we don't have time, I'll make sure to sync up with Damien and we'll get you an answer to your questions and any resources we can. Last but not least, up at the top, there is handouts on this webinar. So if you click handouts, you'll be able to download the process. You should be able to get that now and follow along. That's your process to keep. So go ahead and do that. And when you see us jumping up and around in the process, I'll call out different bullet points so you can follow along. Without further ado, let's do some introductions. I'm Ian Richardson. I owned and operated an MSP out of the mid-Michigan area for 16 years. I sold at the end of 2021, and I'm a co-founder and the main consultant at Richardson and Richardson, along with Carrie, my wife and business partner. And I'm joined today by my friend Damien Stevens, the CEO and founder of Servosity. Damien, how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me, Ian.
I super appreciate you being willing to come on and talk about this. This particular process is pretty near and dear to my heart. There's we'll dive into it a little bit, but Damien, you and I share a little bit of background that we've both, back in our MSP history, had to go through client data loss events.
Hmm.
And the most polite way that I can put that is it sucks.
Yeah, that's right.
That is a burned on the stove situation, and that burn hurts.
Yeah.
You
Lost you there, Ian. Lost your sound there. Still nothing. I don't know if that's just me. If everybody's lost Ian there. All right. Technical difficulties, guys. The joy of trying to do anything live. So looks like Ian's just going to reconnect here 1 second. So if anybody's ever tried to do something like this, you can appreciate that hopefully this is the hardest part of what we're going to do today. So I'm super excited to discuss process with Ian. If you guys lost him around the same time I did, I'd love to hear that.
There we go. How about now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. So the typical IT solution: turn it off and turn it back on.
That's right. Anything live is something's gonna go wrong. That's what I was just saying when you disconnected there. It's just the joy of it. I do my own show, and it's just always something there.
Yep.
So
All right. Appreciate the patience there, folks. Sorry on that. Damien, obviously, if we lose me again because my mic goes squirrely, just continue on, and you can kind of keep talking about whatever we're doing, and I'll pop in and out.
okay,
So as I was trying to say,
all right.
both of our MSPs went through a data loss event, and I always love kind of sharing these stories. And last time you and I dove in, we had shared some kind of frontline stories about this, but without going into anything too descriptive or too painful, share a little bit about what happened back at your MSP that caused that data loss event that led to the development of this process that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you. It sucks. Right? If anybody's been close to this, you'll never forget the feeling, that pit of your stomach, how you feel. Because I was the guy checking the backups. So I was supposed to know that they weren't working. And I had all the green dots. I had all the success emails, the best in class tooling telling me it was working. And went to recover biggest client crashed. They said, I need my server up. That's never a fun time. I went to recover, and you can guess where this is going. It didn't
Mm-hmm.
work. Tens and tens of hours of tech support, pulling out what hair I had. I found out that what it was on the technical side is I was able to take a successful backup of a corrupted volume, and it was my eyes were open. There's, probably
Mm-hmm.
100 ways that best in class tooling can screw you without the right process. And so that's when I decided I'm either going to run towards process and this or away from it. And so to answer your question, Ian, it's testing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds pretty basic, but most, like, the average MSP I talk to says something like, how much data can you afford to lose before the client's going to be really ticked or fire you? Sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's a day's worth, but a day's worth might be it. And then
Yep.
the typical MSP, I'll say, when do you test? And they'll say something between never or maybe quarterly at best. And that's only for a subset of clients that maybe pay me more. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so clearly it's friggin' hard, and we lack the process to test. And that's what I learned. If I don't have a tested backup, I have no idea what I have. Right. So that's what led me to, how do I build a process where testing isn't, if I have time or get around to it or something like that. How's testing built in to the entire system? From the pricing model, can we afford to test? Can we make it efficient enough and effective enough? Because I've also had MSPs that said, look, I had an MSP I was talking to recently. They said, look, we went through a similar situation, and the CEO, was pretty ticked at his CTO. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
go build whatever it takes so we never have to do this again. Cause I'm not willing to do this. This sucked having to go to my client. And the CTO, by the time he looked at all his labor and tried to stitch together a process on the fly, he
Mm-hmm.
said, like, I'm going to probably you need to charge about $600 a month per server, which, if any of you guys have clients willing to pay that, that's
Awesome.
amazing. Right. So it's not easy to do it. Like,
Yep.
you can miss too many things. And then if you don't put in the right process, you're either going to not do a test that's valid, you're going to have, false positive or false negative, or you're going to just waste tons and tons of your time, which will probably end up back in the original boat of, I don't really test often
Yep.
or often enough.
And then you're relying on hope and prayer, which is not a proper disaster recovery scenario
Not a
or
process
strategy.
or a
No.
strategy.
Yeah.
Most people in IT, we start that way, but you gotta evolve, right?
Yeah,
That's
you
not a
you
long-term business strategy.
you grow out of that quick. We had a few different data loss events over the 16 years I was at my MSP, but one of the ones that stands out the greatest is we had a client, and this is where we started forcing compliance. This was probably the earliest example of where we understood what it means to enforce standards, and it was back in 2012, so over a decade ago. We had a client who just wouldn't use us for backup.
Mm,
They're a reasonable sized shop, about 80 people.
mm,
And turned out like they just didn't have backups across their servers, didn't have it. Came on in a January and it went all the way to about a November with discussions where they were hemming and hawing primarily over cost,
mhm.
which is if you're having those sorts of things near the end of the talk, I want to revisit that $600 a server because I think that's a fair price for someone to charge for what we do. And when it came down to it, when they finally approved backup, it was during the install of backup. We found that their primary data RAID was corrupted.
Mhm,
So it was done.
mhm.
Like we tried to do the backup, the array dropped, the data was gone, the system was down, and it was like panic mode. And it took about a month worth of like, so you were talking about days or whatever. We had an outage in their system for about a month,
Mhm.
painstakingly going through their SQL database table by table, row by row, column by column, and restoring it. And the end situation for that client is they ended up having two different databases, one for everything up to 2012 where the loss event occurred, and two for about a 6 week period where they were seeing people and whatever and documenting things. And we had to preserve that little 6 week random window for
Hmm.
7 years. They had to have a split environment where they would go back and forth between databases, and it was a healthcare practice, back and forth between databases to get that 6 week worth of data and validate that there was like the person hadn't been seen in those 6 week times or whatever,
Hmm.
while their main database moved forward. It was, to be blunt, hell.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's interesting, right? What you're pointing out, like they had to live with that for 7 years, right?
Hmm.
That it couldn't have been
Like,
easy on the staff or anything, like, trying to
w-
look in two
when you
different
talk about
systems.
impact, we wrote up a case study around that, and we shared that every single time when we were going in and talking about backup. The way I sold a premium priced backup product
Hmm.
was I said, look, this was from my past. This was my client. I'm not going to identify him. Here's what happened. Here's the impact. And we have to carry this forward for 7 years because of regulation. So
Hmm.
every single time they're seeing someone, it's taking 5 extra minutes. Every time they see a patient, it's 5 extra minutes because they have to log out of a system, switch databases, log in, do a double check, log out, log back in, document. So let's talk about impact there. Not only were they down for here for a 6 week time where production was impacted and there was some limited ability to generate revenue, bill, etc., but that alone really sold a lot of stuff. But I'm going into the weeds. So please grab the handout again and follow along. We're going to dive right in. So talking about talking about point three, and this is protection mechanisms. This is a pretty meaty part of your process where we're thinking about cloud and local. And so one of the big things that I want to start off with is this concept of a two-part system. You need to have local backups and cloud. There's probably plenty of technical people on here, but Damien, like, stitch it together. Why do you need to have both to have a good disaster recovery policy?
Local and cloud, essentially.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So I'll go with maybe the opposite of what people think about, right? Most people sell cloud as the silver bullet. And it can be the right fit, but it is not always. And you mentioned healthcare practice. A lot of times they're running an EMR that does not run in the cloud or not in the cloud well. Or a very common example, you can't run QuickBooks across a VPN. It's not supported.
Hmm.
And so there's just scenarios like that where you need a local device, and not having that is going to either running in the cloud is something you're going to want to test, but it's probably not the ideal scenario. And I'll put it this way, your internet bandwidth is always slower than your LAN bandwidth, your local bandwidth. So
Hmm.
running locally is almost always faster and preferable. That's why we want to have the local copy, so that we can run locally. The server goes down, they get ransomware. We do whatever we got to do to insulate it, and we restore, we do business continuity, restore normal operations, but inside of their local network at local network speeds. And then if you have a true disaster scenario where the building burned down, or there's no electricity for a week, or
Hmm.
ransomware has infected every part of the network, then that's probably when it makes more sense to fall back to a disaster planning scenario where, and look, the reality of it is most small businesses, if their server goes down and the MSP is well prepared, they have a short outage and then they're back up and running. Now it might be on the temporary BDR machine, but from the person checking somebody in, they don't notice any difference. They could
Hmm.
continue to see patients, for example. There's really very little impact. And that's the hopefully more typical scenario versus a disaster, right? If ransomware has every device on the network, they can't use a computer on the network. Um, if the building's flooded or something else, you're not going to be seeing patients. So usually in a disaster scenario, that involves going back to, some people have said, look, we've run out to Best Buy and bought a bunch of laptops
Yep.
and then sent staff to work from home. But depending on the company, it's often a skeleton crew. It's often maybe enough to run payroll or
Yep.
invoice clients, important things like that. And so, you want to think of it in those terms, and you need to be prepared. Just like security, it should be multi-layered. You want to have, different different abilities. And then local or cloud, you want to be able to also recover just a file. They deleted it. They didn't mean to. They need that proposal for that client today, and you can put that back, really easily with the right process.
Yep. And one of the key points you hit on there, which I think is such a powerful piece still under point three, is around retention windows. So the name of the game these days is ransomware, and I'm definitely not a cybersecurity expert by any means. You'll never hear me refer to myself as one. But
Mhm.
from my spot in the sandbox, it's not just the ransomware game, right? They'll encrypt your stuff, they'll steal your stuff, they'll post your stuff online and ransom you that way. There's like
Yeah.
two, three, four different ways that the modern cyber criminal organization comes after you with your data, but it still involves taking that system down.
Mhm.
And there's been long standing studies that if someone gets in, if it's a mature organization versus like someone who just bought a package online and is, running a ransomware 101 op,
Mhm.
the sophisticated orgs, they'll get in and they'll enumerate a network, they'll explore the network, and they might be in there for 3 to 6 months before they launch the attack.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so if you're not having restore points for years,
Mhm.
right? For years back, you might have had someone who's been in the network for a year or 2 years and just playing the long game, trying to wait out that retention policy, trying to see if they can't get a way to be able to, hey, it's set so that if the current date and time, launch this attack automatically, right? And you restore back and then it immediately re-encrypts.
Yeah, the friendly ransomware of prior years was it encrypted you that day or the next day. And
Mhm.
I think it was IBM at a prior RSA hackers conference. They did a big study and they realized the average small business, not Fortune 500, the average small business, the cyber attacker had been in the environment for 7 months before they detected them. So any plan where we're just going to recover from yesterday or something is, or even last week is really out the window if that's the average.
Mhm.
Right. So yeah, we want to have a plan for that. And then, quick story, guys, because I know most either you as an MSP think it probably won't happen to you, or you think it will, and your client definitely thinks it'll never happen to me. Like I run a small doctor's office where I run this main street, but nobody wants, my data. I'm only 12 employees. So we had
Mhm.
a one person MSP. They had their largest client, about 45 users. And this happened a few years ago. It was one of the more sophisticated ones I'd seen. They keylogged the MSP. They ended up getting the MSP's credentials, not only to that environment and domain admin, they ended up getting their credentials to our systems. Now, this is back in the days a few years ago when MFA was optional, if you guys remember those times,
Mhm. Uh-huh.
and they didn't have it enabled and they had gotten their credentials. So they went in and they adjusted the backups to only run C, not D and E. And I had
Mhm.
seen where people stopped a service or killed the backup software or whatever, but that was the first time I'd seen a few years ago that they disabled D&E. Guys, who has the process to detect? Because guess what? We said successful backup in the cloud and
Uh-huh.
remotely of all the C volumes. And then here's the big and then they waited 6 months before they did anything. They had no idea they were in the environment. So when the MSP went to recover, they had only been backing up the C drive, which had none of their data on it for the past 6 months. And if you don't have the process, that's what I remember seeing that going, like, part of me's impressed. That was clever. It was very thoughtful. Part of me is really sick to my stomach that this happened. And
Mhm.
so you've got to build in the process and tooling. Now, look, now hopefully MFA would be enough to deter that, but just imagine if that's what they were doing several years ago, where could they do something simple that your process won't catch?
Yeah, I saw a news article the other day where the Marine Corps tricked AI cameras by quite literally pulling a cardboard box over their head and moving the box around, right? The cameras had been trained to see a human, and a box moving was not enough to alert the camera.
That's pretty cool.
Sometimes you think inside the box versus outside the box, right? Like, okay, well, the thing's going to alarm that the backup failed, so I'll just make sure it succeeds
That's
and
right.
have it back up stuff that doesn't matter.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I had seen a lot more attacks where they just disabled the backup software, turned off a service, tried to disable notifications, but if you can have things that tell you the absence of information, absence of a backup, but
uh,
it was particularly devious when it was like you're getting backups, you're just getting less than you thought you were. And of course, you configured it, you hopefully followed the process, so of course you're not inspecting probably that there's been a change
mhm.
in all the systems and what you're protecting. So that yeah, that's the kind of thing that you know yeah, eyes are opened, and there's 100 more of those that if you don't have a incredibly rigorous process, it'll get you. So I spent many years running an MSP, in the last 15 plus running this, you know, learning the hard ways from either my MSP or others.
No. And so speaking of rigor and all of that, a key part of your process is the creation of standards. So what is the standard of care for an environment in office, multiple offices, whatever, right? An organization stuff. What
Right.
stuff do they have? What stuff do they care about? What stuff needs to be protected and what stuff is whatever, right?
Mhm.
Typical modern environment these days, a desktop, it's kind of like, you know what? All their stuff's stored to network drives or cloud drives or whatever. The desktop gets blown, we're just going to reformat it
Right.
or reimage it or whatever. We don't have to back that up. But those servers, those key cloud environments, you do have to back that type of stuff up. And so you talk about in step 4 creation of documentation standards, right?
Mhm.
Here is what we document about an environment. Here's how we set up an environment step by step for protection, so that we have the protection mechanisms in, and here is step by step how we would recover a standard environment. So talk about some of the things that an organization needs to consider, an MSP, or if you happen to be from internal IT or a different type of organization watching, welcome. Talk to us about some of the steps you guys use when it comes to creating the gold standard for a Servosity environment.
Yeah, there's the process of what matters, and then you carry it out a couple ways. And a lot of people confuse tools like IT Glue as process, right? Which is it's a great documentation tool, but it's not process by itself. And so, a lot of MSPs I talk to, there's one of two scenarios. They'll say, "Oh, I have all my tech set up backups." And when
Mhm.
I talk to the owner and they're candid, they're not going to admit this to the public, but in a one-on-one, they'll say they all five set it up a little differently. They may always get the system root volume or not. And then, some of
Mhm.
them have different retention. They run it more frequently versus less. And that might individually, those things may sound fairly innocuous, but at any scale, you can't predict what you have and what you don't have, nor can you really build process around. If I didn't get a backup an hour, that's an issue because Bob sets them up every 2 hours, but Susie runs them every 15 minutes. So,
Mhm.
so the other scenario is they'll say, no, no, I have this one engineer that I trust with everything. They were the first person here. They're now maybe the head of service delivery, and they're
Mhm.
really good. They're really technical. That person probably gets sick. They
Yeah.
probably go on vacation. There's probably someday they won't be there. And I don't mean leave your company. I just mean, being human, they need time off. They need those things. And so it revolves around them. And you end up with this tribal knowledge instead of process and documentation where, this person is the one that knows really everything and not the others. So right, the
Mhm.
challenge is how do you do this 100 times over and it be exactly the same, no matter if Bob or Susie did it, Now, I don't care if you have 5 techs setting it up or if it's always Susie and Bob fills in when Susie's out. The process should be the same. So you can have tooling that will help with that. Some of the better, more operationally mature MSPs, a little hack is you can have MSP number 1 set up the environment and MSP 2 audit that it matches the process. And you're not trying to say the goal of that isn't to call out the person as a fallible human. Just the goal is that is somebody besides the person that sets it up has to check it, because we all get a phone call, we get a ticket, even if it's not business related, you get a text,
Yep.
and you miss a step. And that, that could mean you had retention set 30 days instead of a year. You're in a whole different
This
ballgame.
is a great I want to hone in on something there, because we did this in a limited scope at my MSP, but it was one of the things that I always wanted to set up a bit more. This is a great opportunity for those of you who talk to your local competition, right? And I'll put competition in quotes. You're talking to a good local competitor. Form a mutual auditing relationship
Mm-hmm.
where, hey, you know what? We're going to have a non-com signed on each of our client lists. If a bid comes up from those, we're going to let the other guys know. We're going to say, hey, like, hands off on this. We're not going to compete for each other's business. So
Mm-hmm.
you can remove the threat of competition from one of your best competitors, and you can raise the tide on both, right? You
Right.
can audit backup environments, you can perform risk assessments, etc. You can be each other's third party auditor,
Mm-hmm.
where all that's going to do is do MRR upsell and project revenue,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know what? Like, per the audit standards, because you audit in the exact same way. So, hey, you know what? You don't have MFA or your backup. You've got a gap between your expectations and what exists today. And that is an upsell opportunity. And
Yeah.
you have someone other than you come in and deliver that news. You're the people who come in and say, hey, we talked with Bob over at ABC IT. Let us know the audit was completed. He shared the findings. Let's go through and talk about how we'll solve for each one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not you who's doing it. It's Bob from the outside company saying that. So you're just coming in and saying, well, it's the audit recommendations. Let's go through and do it. But then
That's
they
right.
can't, there's no finger pointing there, right? It can become a collaborative environment. I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
So,
It's a great point, Ian. The you will find much more, and you just get more credibility as a third party, right?
mhm.
If you come back and say we need to do more in backups, most clients say no, we're fine. But if there's a third party that comes through and assesses it and gives that's just not you guys, they're going to probably listen more closely. Um, and what you said also on kind of competing together, what's what we need to do instead of see all of our MSPs as competition, right? The number 4 and the number 5 can get together and do what you said and beat number 1, because together you're better, even if they're large or whatever their skill set is. And this is how you deliver a better end product to the customer, which is how you really win.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the opportunities, there could be a whole nother process about a whole nother discussion for a later Thursday process webinar series about forming those relationships with competitors, because everybody needs to exit, right? And you take two, $3 million MSPs and put them together, suddenly you got a $6 million offer, and it's a heck of a lot more attractive. So
Mm-hmm.
those of you who are thinking about that end game, that's an easy way to start it. So, thinking about, and I want to circle back to a previous point, that documentation, creation of the standard, you highlighted this around that tribal knowledge, that single person, Susie, who sets up all the environments, and Susie may need to take a vacation, Susie might be out sick, Susie may leave the organization one way or another. You don't want that information, that knowledge to leave. But
Mm-hmm.
another big piece is just making sure that, again, that you can scale. You don't want to have Susie be the roadblock or barrier or risk factor, but removing those single points of reliance should be the core of any business continuity plan. You don't want one thing to grind business to a halt, either at your client or at your MSP. You want both. You want that situation, those reliance points, those bottlenecks removed whenever possible. And I have to imagine that creation of the standard, And training to the standard, especially cross training to the standard, is what does that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's work. There has to be process created, and you have to find another either MSP or at least a different engineer. And depending on your MSP, that could be just a different engineer. It could be that uh, if you're split up into maybe services versus recurring, it's two different
Mhm.
groups. But the more different their viewpoints are, the better, right? The worst is the two engineers that always kind of work on each other's customers. Those are going to give you the least insights. You want the folks that come in and have a fresh perspective of why are we doing it this way? And it seems like this
Mhm.
is something we should be doing on others. The other thing I'll say is most MSP's process isn't created overnight, it evolves. So the question is then how do you take this new learning and go and make sure you apply it uniformly to every
Mhm.
single um, uh, of your existing clients, because now you have this new part you've added to your process, and it's only on the new clients that you've added this year. And but you've probably had a client for 7 years. So are they getting the worst process that you originally had when you originally
Mhm.
brought them on?
Yep. Well, and that cycle of renewal, right? And business continuity, security, just general operating procedures, right? Process isn't written in stone. It gets built up over time. It gets improved based off lessons learned. And what you just said resonates with me is that's like your account management team, right? If client one had a negative outcome and
Hmm.
we've gained some learnings from that, go to the rest of your clients and share that case study. Hey, look, we touched the hot stove. We
Hmm.
learned through an issue. Here's what happened over at this client. They're just like you. They have a situation just like you. This happened and this was the result. Let's avoid that in your building. It doesn't mean that it will happen to you, but we might as well like do this work, which can be billable, right? We might as well do this work and improve your scenario to avoid that outcome because here was the impacts for them and I don't want to see that for you.
Right. And I
And
think you bring
client.
up a really good point, though.
Mhm.
Most MSPs I talk to will share that with me. They wouldn't share that on a discussion that's live like this. They certainly don't want to tell their clients. I think you need to make it a case study. You need to talk about
Mhm.
these things. I think most of them are embarrassed or afraid to admit that, like, one time we did something that wasn't perfect. Um,
Mhm.
and they're just unwilling to have any conversation like that, even if that's something that would not only improve their process but improve their relationship with their client. So get out of your comfort zone and talk about how you are improving your process, and even more when it came from getting burned when you touched the stove. That's the one that resonates. That's the story they're going to remember, not just it's 2023. We have a better process now. That's not nearly as compelling.
Well, and that vulnerability can be not only a superpower for new revenue, but it can save you from unrealistic expectations. If you are promising perfection, you are setting your customers up to be constantly disappointed, right? Like
Hmm.
nobody can have perfect service delivery. Nobody can have perfect disaster recovery. Perfection doesn't exist in technology, or else none of us would have jobs. So
That's right.
the getting out of your own way and setting realistic expectations and saying, look, like here's the best effort. And when we learn something, my promise to you is that I'm going to come to you and share the story that happened somewhere else. And if
Hmm.
something bad happens here, I'm going to share it with others. I'm not going to call you out by name, but I'm going to say, we had a client. Here's the situation. Here's what happened. Here's what we learned. Let's change. Let's pivot because that rising tide will raise all boats.
Absolutely. That's the benefit of being an MSP for so many years. You're going to see, no offense to the internal IT guys listening, but you're going to see more than the internal IT guy, because you see so many orgs, so many different setups, so many different mistakes that either the
Mhm.
client makes or your team makes, and you can benefit from that if you're willing to share it.
So I want to highlight something before we kind of move on to management, and I'm popping down for those of you following around to the massive meat and potatoes of this. It's a whole page worth of process documentation, which is around testing and validation.
Hmm.
And so the key thing on there, look at the document, look at the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly items. If you got questions, ping Damien on this. But one of the key things here is around consistency. And
Hmm.
so I want to have you just dive into, hey, what's the risk of consistency? And then we'll flow into management after that. But talk to us about how you ingrain a culture of it's got to be each time, every time, all the time.
Yeah, and you brought up the word culture, which is important because I've talked to some people that when I talk about how consistency is king, sometimes they react and say, "Gosh, that sounds really boring." Like, I love firefighting. I got into IT because I want to learn the new stuff all the time, which you should do. But there's a difference between learning the latest, how to have fun with the latest AI chatbot or latest
Mhm.
cybersecurity trends versus let's just have a whole um, grab bag of process. You want to have consistent, predictable process, and that way you can predict if your retention is not the same, uniform. Now, you might have the standard is a year, and for healthcare, the standard is 7. That's fine. But you need to know that, and you need to have those types of standards. You also need to have, like, some people, uh, they kind of get retention, but they don't see frequency of backup as the same. They go, oh, well, some client, their server's slower. I'm going to run it once or twice a day. Other ones, theirs is faster. I'll run hourly. And other ones are, I'm going to run every 15 minutes. And
Mhm.
there might be rare cases where that's an absolute must, but most of the time, that's just not the case. You need to have a conversation with them about what risk that's introducing. Maybe there is time for hardware refresh, but if you know that not only do we have this retention, but we have this backup frequency, then when any client crashes, you can say, I can go back to 15 minutes ago or an
Yep.
hour ago or whatever. And if you have all kinds of different clients with all sorts of different backup intervals, retentions, and then you multiply that times. Do you encrypt it? Do you store it locally? And do you always store it in the cloud? Do you keep less in the cloud? Here's another one I want to bring up. Am I using 3 different backup vendors to get the job done? You know, super common, right? And I know there is no perfect backup vendor. We are one. So I can say they can, at least in my
Mhm.
example, but being spread across multiple vendors ensures that you will be a jack of all trades and a master of none. And that almost entirely ensures you will not have consistency because when Susie set it up vendor A, it's one way, and when Bob set up vendor B, it was another way. And they all have different buttons to press, and whether they validate things or upload things or test things. And again, IT is complex, right? However, it takes a
Mhm.
local backup versus a cloud backup are often different. There can be different backup intervals and retentions and encryptions, and all of these are all variables that you need to stamp out and say, no, there is one way, and we're very opinionated about this at Serosity. And I recommend that you become very opinionated about it too, because a lot of tools give you 100 ways to run a backup by the
Mhm.
time you look at all the variables. But 98, 99 of them will shoot you in the foot.
Well, and so one of the key things there, I want to highlight on there is that complexity breeds confusion,
Hmm.
and confusion is what leads to poor outcomes, either for you, your client, or both. And that's just if you can eliminate those variables, different types of products, different vendors, different ways you set up, different retention policies, different backup intervals, the simpler you can make any process, not just your disaster recovery process, but any process, the simpler you can make it, the easier it is to be followed. And when your process is followed, you have predictable inputs, it leads to predictable outcomes, and that's what you want on your worst day of the week is you want a very predictable outcome. So thinking
That,
about management and some of these management items, this is an example of keep it simple.
mm-hmm,
Manage to zero type metrics, yes, no type checks, right?
mm-hmm,
Like, are you doing yes or no? Not kinda, not well, 80% of the time. Nope, that's a no.
mm-hmm.
And
That's
I
right.
love that focus on yes, no metrics. But one of the key metrics that you mentioned from a managerial point of view is thinking about the DR environment. Do you have the resources? Do you have the capacity to support growth? So look at what your client's been doing, and I've got a great example of this. We were big in healthcare. We had one healthcare practice that had 12 doctors, 8 mid-levels. They serviced both major health systems in the region that we were in Michigan. So both hospital systems, they were the quote unquote people. They were the guys who handled their particular specialty. And their data doubled every 3.5 years. Like the images, the amount of stuff they were doing, their data was doubling every 3.5 years. It was massive growth, even with compression, even with whatever, right?
Mm-hmm,
And so we looked at that and we said, all right, what's 12 months look like? Well, that needs 30% extra capacity. And so a backup appliance, which we might have normally been able to get away with, hey, like this is a 4 to 5 year server buy, it was about 2 years. Every
mm-hmm.
2 years, we were like, nope, got to refresh it, got to refresh it, got to refresh it. And so making sure that you build that in, that you look at your client's growth and you ask them, hey, are you trying to grow faster or slower or whatever, right? Like what's your business plan, and tie that into your process is a big part of that managerial function, and I love that focus on it.
Yeah, if you don't have it aligned with their business growth, you're in trouble. And um, speaking of process, not everybody has the process to know when they're 70 or 80% of capacity. And
Hmm.
we all know there's the technical thing, which is don't fill it up. But way before then, there's the business conversation that there's going to be some cost involved to get the
Hmm.
bigger, faster, larger devices, and build that into your sales conversation from day one and talk about their growth, but also have the controls in place to understand that the team needs to get alerted to get approval on that and order that and get it in place before before you're at the situation where you're not taking backups because you filled. I can't tell you many people like, oh well, we realized we were 80 or 85%, and then we reached out to the client, and then they didn't call us back for 2 weeks, and we're at 100%. So by the time
Hmm.
we actually had a conversation with them, we have no backups going on. And technically they grew. I kind of understand it, but from a process perspective, you waited way too late to
Hmm.
begin that conversation.
Man, it's such a different conversation to be sitting down with someone and saying, hey, Damien, we did a routine review. We're predicting in 9 months this is going to be out of the way, so let's just go ahead and get this dealt with now. Right? 9 months, we're going to be at a situation where if something goes bump in the night, you're not protected. And
Hmm.
so I know you've got an approval process. Here's this. It's good for whatever, 30 days. Go ahead and take it back. Get approval for that plus 10%. We'll rebid it. Just make sure that there hasn't been any sort of massive flux, and then we'll get approval for any sort of variance from this at least budget figure,
Hmm.
and then go from there, right? But just start being a little bit proactive. And so one of the things that happened recently, and we've been telling stories throughout this, but here's real life story, right? And I want to circle back to, hey, are you able to charge $600 a server? And so I'm going to throw it down for those of you who are on the call that you should charge $600 a server a month. And the reason why is Rackspace.
Hmm.
Everybody's heard of them. Everybody heard of this big thing, but there was Damien, you shared this, and then I went out and pulled exact figures, but Rackspace had about 1 to 2% of revenue being generated from hosted exchange, and that caused a 44% loss in stock value from
Holy crap.
one to 2% of revenue. And so if you're charging $50 a server, $100 a server for this comprehensive risk mitigation service, like what is the what is what are you doing?
Right.
This is your client's operations. Hey, what happens if 100% of your data is gone tomorrow? Can
Hmm.
your business function? If the answer is no, then the cost should reflect that impact, right? It's not just about getting the stuff back. It's about how quickly, how much, how much can you, guarantee? What are the protection mechanisms in? Have the discovery conversation around impacts, and then relate that to the cost. And if someone pushes back on costs, say it's $600 time. Yes, it's $6,000 a month. You have 10 servers. Yes, I understand that's $72,000 a year, but you're a, $30 million organization. What happens if we can't make $30 million a year anymore?
Right.
Is that $72,000 not reasonable?
Right.
And so you play with the numbers a bit, but I would push that every year your backup cost should be going up, similar to your managed service agreement. And your backup costs probably need to be dramatically raised. But don't just go in and say, hey, we need to charge you more for backup. Hey, we'd like to have a conversation about your business.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Ian, I think there is a pretty common viewpoint amongst MSPs that technology, since it's improving,
Mm-hmm.
should get less expensive. And so I think they think, oh, well, I should pay less than what I did for 5 years ago. But if you provide the same thing, then maybe in the market, you're going to lose the price war. You need to continue to add value. So, two things. Number one, mindset
Mm-hmm.
shift. Things shouldn't always get cheaper, especially if you want on your side or on the vendor side people involved. Because if you guys haven't been paying attention, hiring and retaining good people has not gotten any cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, what we all know in the last few years is the risk to the client and to you is far more than it was 5 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
or a year ago even. And so, I'm not saying to price yourself on the market or charge unreasonably, but most are charging unreasonably cheap. And they're
Mm-hmm.
saying the client won't pay, so I'll give them some number. And it's like you said, it's almost like there are a pretty decent number of MSPs where it feels like it's name your price.
Yep.
And that's not reflecting their risk. You're doing them a disservice. I think some people think, well, if I didn't do this, they wouldn't have a backup. No, they go to somebody else, and then the other person would say, it's either this or you can't have us. An MSP put it well. They said, you get to choose whether you hire us as your mechanic. You don't get to tell me what brand of tools I keep in my toolbox.
Yep.
Because I know the best ones to be able to service you. And so if you price it the right way, then you can de-risk your business and theirs, which is what you should be doing. You should be de-risking both of you. But you've got to talk about that value. And frankly, I understand the plight, right? It's backups. Cheapest is best. But you have to educate them to the risk of not having a fast enough recovery time or recovery process or cyber resilience, or we could go into more things later, but there is a lot of risk there. And a $30 million company with a $50 a month backup, you've put them in a tremendous amount of risk, and yourself, because it's not going to be pretty. They're going to blame you. That was my experience. I couldn't blame the vendor, the best in class vendor. And I couldn't say, well, we have a backup. It's just a backup of corrupted volume. Right? They didn't care. They paid us for our knowledge and expertise, and they expected us to be able to recover when they need to be able to
Mm-hmm.
recover. And that's the only thing that any reasonable business person is going to expect.
Yeah, you can't, the line I always talked about is if you need life-saving surgery, you're not looking for the discount guy at Walmart, right? Like that's
you're
backup and
not looking
disaster.
for the cheapest heart surgeon.
Yeah, disaster planning and business continuity is life-saving surgery for your business. Like, do you want your business to survive or do you want it to die? It's your choice. I don't care. It's not my
Mm-hmm.
business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the one who's going out of business after someone hacked something and blew up my stuff. You are.
Mm-hmm.
So like make your choice. So I wanna take a couple of minutes and Damien, just dive in. We've been talking about disaster planning, we've been talking about business continuity. How can Servosity help the modern MSP make this manageable? to implement a standard of care across their client base?
Yeah, so obviously I went through this myself. I experienced this, and my hope is you can take this process and not and learn from the years and years I spent as MSP and the 15 plus I've spent servicing all these MSPs. So you can take this process and implement it with any backup tool, by the way, right? Any
Mhm.
backup tool will do it. Um, or you can hire us to do that for you. I care that you do something differently and that you actually de-risk your business and your clients. Um, and whether you do it by hiring us or not, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that you actually do something, make a change. Don't sit there. Don't be like every other
Mhm.
MSP, because in addition to the risk of cyber risk, you're also adding risk because they're going to come and eat your lunch when they come with a much better process and much better preparation. And when they're able to talk about all the things that they do, because frankly, most of the IT industry says they don't say these words, but their pitch is trust us, we're good guys, and we'll
Yeah.
get you back up and running, right? There's really nothing, there's no meat in there. There's no formality. There's no SLA. There's not even an implied time of which we can recover you in 4 business hours from a backup from
Mhm.
15 to 30 minutes ago, in this scenario, or during an entire disaster like ransomware or your building burned down. We can have you up and running in 24 hours and from a backup from this time period. You can easily have those conversations, whether they're formal SLAs or not. You just have to be willing to make the change. I appreciate
Yep.
Ian in our discussion because he's helped me formalize this process so we could give this to you guys today. And this is actually something we've had for a long time, but never made available externally. So download the process. If you would like to get connected to Servosity or me, go to servosity.com/call, and that will allow you to book a call directly with me, geek out on this process and how you can save your own butt. So if you'd like to talk about this process, um, just in itself, I'll be happy to have a chat with you about it. If you'd like to talk about what we do or how we do it or how we make the tools kind of conform to the process, and how I had to do it with other tools, not just mine, then I'm happy to have a conversation with you. And then lastly, guys, we've talked a lot about growth, and running your business and cash flow. And we even mentioned exit, right? We talked about that. So if you would like to join me, I have a show later today at damienstevens.live. That will take you to my LinkedIn profile. You can follow me to get updates. And at 2 p.m. today, we're going to be talking about how to exit and how
Mhm.
putting in the right metrics, essentially, which is process, but at a business level, are what ensure the right outcomes. So I'm here to help, whether that's the DR process or talking about how to exit your business.
Yeah, no, make sure that you go there, pop onto DamienStevens.live to catch that, and you can reach out to Damien on LinkedIn. We'll go ahead and put those information there. We've only got a couple of minutes left. If you have any questions, make sure you throw them out over there. As Damien also mentioned, if you click on handouts in the upper right hand corner, you can download this process. It's yours for keep. There's not any like hidden or ambiguous items. We talk about exactly what you should be doing on that weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual basis to make sure things are protected and that you're testing accurately. And there's a good section in there about defining what is not testing. So make sure you grab that. One question that I do see here, Damien, that I want to throw over. I've got a thought on it, but how can you start the conversation about raising prices on backup? And I would say that this really does focus on discovery. So just like with any other thing, having the conversation around values. But Damien, the webinar ends in just about 60 seconds. So why don't you take it away? How would you start the conversation with someone when you're scared about talking about raising those prices? 50 seconds left.
Yeah, thanks. Value. It's always value. What can I do that's going to help your business be less risk and have less risk in it? So you need to talk about how you're going to do things better than just backup. You have to be specific and how that's going to, and you can't talk in technical terms. It sounds like flux capacitor. Last thing I'll leave you with kind of two trends for 23. One, insurance carriers are asking, and I've seen it this week, are your backups immutable? Most people, most MSPs don't know what that is. Consider that, because when they ask, you need to answer that. Secondly, insurance carriers are starting to ask, when's the last time you performed a DR test? Most people, the answer is never or not recently. Don't get caught flat-footed.
Perfect. Thanks, Damien, again. Until next time, everyone, take it easy.
Bye, guys.